Craig Foss.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was wondering, and now I know why all these Labor speakers today are so angry. They seem very excitable and angry. And of course, with this new continued left takeover of Labor, as we've seen announced today with the Labor-Greens merger or whatever they're calling it, actually I can see some of their frustration and anger coming through, Mr Speaker. And Mr Hipkins earlier was very, very excitable in his speech, and you know he's a good orator in the House, of course, but I guess he's frustrated with the thought of perhaps Catherine Delahunty from the Greens becoming the opposition spokesman for education. And as we go through that, we can start, or perhaps joint leaders or joint ownership or whatever they're going to call it. It's quite interesting what we've just seen today. And I guess I was just thinking there's probably two people smiling from ear to ear, Mr Speaker, with these announcements as we discuss the wider ramifications of this budget. And of course, I guess New Zealand First are very comfortable and happy with today's announcements because actually shows that Labor's totally abandoned ground voters, a voting bloc which perhaps they thought was once theirs. And I'm sure the New Zealand First MPs are smiling, yes they are, from ear to ear, with what they've seen, with the colleagues they might sit with, but they can see it a mile away as we can. What's happening to the left of New Zealand politics is now becoming the far left of New Zealand politics. And, Mr Speaker, I guess the only other person smiling here, perhaps, I'm sure there are others, of course, would be Nick Smith and perhaps Nikki Wagner, leading our Blue-Greens in our National Party, and our concentration on actual things that matter in our environment, pursuing policies that help our environment and preserve our awesome environment in New Zealand, not like what the Greens who tend to endlessly pick up causes, be it .com, be it Panama, Pelican Brief nonsense, be it whatever, as opposed to the real matters, Mr Speaker, as we concentrate on matters in the budget.
A point of order, David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm sure this contribution we're hearing to is interesting to somebody, but sir, to date, the Speaker is several minutes into his 10 and he has not yet once referenced the appropriations bill or the budget. I wonder if he might contain himself and give us his thoughts on that.
Thank you very much for your point of order. Of course, relevancy is for the adjudicator to decide on. It is a wide-ranging budget. It is a wide-ranging speech, and those speeches have been wide-ranging. But your point is well made, and no doubt he will have a reference to the budget forthwith.
Mr Speaker, of course, as I'm speaking on the Appropriations 2016 Estimates Bill, and interesting that I could segue into I don't know, we could compare it with the Venezuelan budget, actually, because the opposition tend to be going down that track. But I might come to that later, as I wonder what their version of the same bill, Mr Speaker, might be. Mr Speaker, look, this budget does continue national steady as she goes, conservative, prudent management of our economy, of our future, of our people, delivering fiscally, delivering economically, and most importantly, delivering socially. And delivering to those groups of New Zealanders, increasingly so, who most of New Zealand expect, deserve or need or require our assistance as a civilised nation, and putting resources to where they are needed most, which will pay dividends later in their lives for either themselves and, of course, all our country, Mr Speaker. It reflects our country where we are now, growing in confidence, an open trading nation. In fact, interesting to have that debate with the other side now with their merger and their continued opposition to free trade and TPP. As New Zealand is now growing in confidence, an open trading, innovative nation, Mr Speaker, reflected in the forecast of the bill, of the budget, and of course recorded in our outlook for New Zealand. Interestingly, I'm looking at Mr Little's proposed amendment to the Honourable Bill English's speech. And I look at that, and essentially that says, and opposition members will be voting against, if they agree with that amendment, actually they'll be voting against business tax changes. The most fundamental changes in small business, particularly taxation, in decades, Mr Speaker. Probably the last one was when we lowered the corporate tax rate, business tax rate, from 30 to 28 cents in the dollar. Excuse me, Mr Speaker. Every election, opposition parties will talk about provisional tax, terminal tax, government compliance around tax. They all promised to do something. In government, they never did. In government, we have. We've committed. We're investing in systems to allow changing the burden and, of compliance and around provisional tax to a closer pay-as-you-go, closer to a GST-type model, widely welcomed by small businesses across our country. The budget delivers surplus, ongoing surplus, Mr Speaker, to the tune of about $6 billion in a couple of financial years' time. Pretty good. It continues to deliver on low interest rates, creating an environment for certainty, creating lower interest rates for all New Zealanders. Remember, New Zealanders and those who are listening, imagine what their mortgage rates would be now if Labor had continued in office, or in fact if Labor were writing this budget. There would be rampant inflation, rampant double-digit mortgage interest rates like there were when Labor were last in office. Mr Speaker, interestingly, and I haven't heard other speakers on this one yet, it delivers an improved current account. I recall the Honourable Michael Cullen, who perhaps struggled against some of his spending ministers in his time in government and must have given up, I suppose, in his last 3 or 4 years. But he continued to talk about the need to fix and work on our current account, as have other Labor spokespeople over the years, and yet they're silent on this one because, again, it shows once forecasts become reality, this national government keeps delivering. It talks about job growth, Mr Speaker. 200,000 new jobs, up from 170,000 as our economy grows over the forecast period. It forecasts lower CPI, as I just alluded to. It also, though, as well as the fiscal side of things, delivers higher, more increased spending in education, in health, across our social services, Mr Speaker. It is an outstanding budget, an outstanding result, and outstanding forecast results in the OECD. In every single country we compare ourselves and commentators compare us to, it is an outstanding result. Mr Speaker, even with those outstanding forecasts, as Minister Brownlee was talking about earlier, some of the assumptions in it are very, very conservative. So even getting about 3% growth, and even with a forecast doubling of oil prices, and even with a decrease in migration to about 12,000 per annum, even with those constraints, we're delivering forecast surpluses growing over the next many, many years, over the forecast period, up to about $6 billion in 2020. What a good problem to have, Mr Speaker. One thing, Mr Speaker, particularly to that previous speaker, why does the opposition not embrace and value the social investment approach? Why do they not think it is a good thing that within the limited resources of government, that those who actually need assistance now, need some wraparound now to help them in their current circumstances and to perhaps get them on a better path for themselves and for our country over many, many years to come, why they don't endorse that. I was thinking of Sir Walter Nash, actually, because what were the first state houses? They were social investment, a long-term investment originally for housing for those that need it, and yet Labor is now against that type of policy. I can absolutely assure the member who seemed to be complaining that it was something about short-termism or something like that, actually the whole investment approach, as documents have shown, as ministers have spoken about, it is very, very long-term. So as MPs want to look at those taxpayers in the eyes and say, actually, because of this social investment approach, we've helped so many New Zealanders, we've helped so many families, we're concentrating on helping them into a home, not necessarily a house. We've moved what you would have needed to pay in taxes over the next 30-odd years from $82 billion to around $70 billion. That's not too bad. And the member obviously didn't do even bookkeeping 101, because that's actually what goes on the balance sheet, those kind of numbers. And that enables better, more choices, more options for the government, whoever they might be, over the coming years, to allocate the resources of the government to help people through circumstances by and large, not of their own making. Mr. Speaker, I do worry. We have had this announcement today, however it plays out, but as the opposition lurches even further to the left, I suggest that actually if the opposition's parties were running this budget, if we were wondering what it might look like, actually over time what we see in Venezuela now is probably not too dissimilar. Rampant inflation, no control over spending, no target of spending or resources or assistance or whatever it might be. Great rhetoric, but actually on the ground those are hurt the most from left spend-up large governments, such as we seem to be hearing from the other side, are actually the most vulnerable in our society. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud and comfortable to continue to support this budget, both fiscally, dryly, economically and socially. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.